On the night of the 14th of November 1940, Coventry Cathedral was almost completely destroyed. Only the spire stood unscathed, as it has stood for almost 6 centuries. Today, in the presence of Her Majesty the Queen, the new Cathedral Church of St. Michael will be consecrated by the Lord Bishop of Coventry. Over now to Richard Dimbleby at Coventry.
75,000 people applied for tickets to come to this service today. 75,000 people from all over the world. Only 2,000 could be accommodated inside the cathedral. Outside, and here you see them, there are hundreds and thousands more. Some of them in special stands built within the old cathedral. They will watch the service inside on big television monitors and listen to it through loudspeakers. But before them, as the symbol that hope can spring from despair, there stands this new 20th century cathedral. The only new cathedral built entirely since the end of the Second World War.
I'm standing on the steps to the south of the porch of the new cathedral, which is dedicated, like the old one, to St. Michael. The nave of the new cathedral stretches away behind me. Now, how this all came to be built is an extraordinary story of faith and courage.
It's both a war memorial for those who died here in the Blitz, a cathedral, but also a national monument, and the sort of tug of war between those different stakeholders. It tells us quite a lot about the state of England in the 1950s, early 1960s.
It came at just the right time. The war was not so far away, and it was a new world. And I think that people felt that this could be a symbol for all that we wanted, all that was positive, all that we felt our children would grow up and it would be not exactly a brave new world, but a better world.
The great service of consecration is soon to begin. And meanwhile, we have time to see something of the bold and startling beauty of this church, of its controversial design, its brilliant success, because this, then, is the building designed and built by Sir Basil Spence in 10 years of unremitting planning and labour.
Consecrated in May 1962, Coventry's new Cathedral Church of St. Michael was conceived and built in the 2 decades after World War II. These were years of reconstruction, of the welfare state, and a consumer boom, when the country formed new relationships with European foes and friends, and when it began to come to terms with the modern world. In its design, in the skills and crafts that made it possible, and in its exceptional works of art, Coventry Cathedral combines old and new, tradition and the contemporary. Using archive images and photographs, and with voices from yesterday and today, this film tells the story of the cathedral and of the times in which it was created. Its architect, Basil Spence, called it a phoenix rising from the flames. Today, it is one of the greatest of the buildings for a new Britain.
The city of Coventry, in the middle of England. It grew out of a monastery in the 11th century. It grew into a town that was famous 700 years ago for its trade in wool and cloth. Into a town famous all over Britain and in all trading countries for its silks and silk dyeing, its cotton and carpets and watches, into a great industrial town in the industrial middle of the country. Into a city of engineering, where motor cars were made, and aeroplanes and radios and telephones. A city of spires and towers, an ancient city which produced from its hundreds of factories the newest machines and engines in the world.
On the 14th of November 1940, in one of the first significant air raids outside London, German bombers targeted the factories and workshops that clustered close to Coventry's centre.
Die englische Flak ist auf dem Posten. Ein wahrer Feuerhagel prasselt uns entgegen, aber ungehindert geht es weiter.
Postwar Coventry. Der Bombenschütze löst die ersten Bomben. Unten ist bereits die erste Wirkung zu erkennen. Die Brände werden immer zahlreicher und das ist erst der Anfang. Immer neue Einschläge blitzen auf. Über 500.000 Kilogramm Bomben wurden in einer einzigen Nacht über Coventry abgeworfen. Führende amerikanische Blätter schrieben, Coventry sei dem Erdboden gleichgemacht worden. Mr. Churchill aber faselt immer noch von der Unbezwingbarkeit seiner Royal Air Force.
Large areas of the old city were devastated. 568 people were killed and over 800 severely injured.
Up on the top roof and the lower roofs and the ground floor we waited, and then bomb after bomb, incendiary bombs fell, and we fought them with what we could of the equipment we had, one after the other. It took a long time. The fire got a big hold. The fire station came, but well, there was not sufficient water to deal with it, and the fire got a complete grip of the roof and burnt from roof to roof, and all the pews blazed up, that great inferno inside. That night the city burnt, and the mother church of the city, and yet the tower and the spire still stand, soaring to the sky, and I feel that's an emblem of the eternal majesty and love of God.
Provost Howard's commitment to rebuild the cathedral was actually itself an emotional and a theological response. He was overwhelmed with this conviction that just as the cathedral had been crucified with Christ, it would rise with him.
Later, a shrine was built on the west wall from the stones of the ruins, with a cross fashioned from the charred beams of the medieval roof, and a smaller cross made from the nails which had bound the beams together. The Cross of Nails, now famous throughout the world. This was the only Anglican cathedral destroyed in the last war.
You can actually rebuild as a sign of defiance, almost of revenge, or you can simply rebuild as a form of memorialization. This rebuilding was actually neither of those, fascinatingly. And that was partly to do with the way that Provost Howard was so convinced that a new future needed to be rebuilt in friendship and reconciliation with enemies.
Coventry was one of the first cities in Britain to have a complete plan for rebuilding. In this plan, the centre of the city, largely destroyed, is to be rebuilt entirely. The planners of Coventry believe that cities only exist for the use of people. They believe that everyone should feel that it's worth his while to make his city, or town or village, a good, decent, pleasant place to live in. In war, we work together to destroy a common evil. In peace, we must work with no less vigour for the common good.
In 1938, Coventry had appointed a progressive young architect, Donald Gibson, who drew up an ambitious plan for the city, which was presented to the public in an exhibition early in the war.
A few hours after the opening, just as I was leaving the city, the sirens started and the bombs started to fall. Hitler's bombers, by concentrating on the center of the city, were about to make it possible for an imaginative scheme to rise from the ashes and the blood of the old Coventry.
At the heart of those plans for reconstruction was a commitment to build thousands of new houses for soldiers returning from the fighting and for the families who would create the better world that the war had made possible.
After the war, there can be no thinking of returning to the good old days, the days of cramped houses in crippling streets, of slums still living on in a lingering death from the last century, of the sprawling, dull, same-faced miles of suburbia. After the war, great numbers of houses must be built quickly and well.
This is a good model, Betty, isn't it? The city had better be good, too. This is where we're going to live.
It was the sort of poster child for reconstruction, actually. It was a very well-organised city. Donald Gibson and his very large architectural team set to work redesigning absolutely everything, from street furniture to this new road system, Ring Road, to new housing, obviously, the schools that were needed for the young population, because Coventry was a boom town.
Not only did they build new homes, new schools, and new churches, but the city became an international showplace. The entire centre was completely rebuilt, free from traffic, open, gay, and modern in spirit. This same spirit was to inspire the building of the new cathedral.
In the 40s, he designs a city which separates traffic, motor traffic and pedestrian, and has this extraordinary new pedestrianised shopping centre. But interestingly, it's aligned precisely on the tower and spire of St. Michael's. So you were always going to be conscious of it there. New Coventry was always going to be conscious of the history of this place.
What you see before you is what is called the precincts. And it has a very large shopping area with only foot passengers, you see. And it seems to offer, doesn't it, the possibility of a happy democratic life. And that's the character of the architecture. No high, no low, no dark shadows, nothing outstanding. Well, you can't expect it to look like Florence or Rome or even Edinburgh. This is Festival of Britain architecture. Light, trim, democratic.
Coventry is going to be a place to live in where people believe that human life can be good and pleasant. In the days to come, we must feel that it is not every man for himself, but every man for the good and happiness of all people living. Every man must believe in the good and happiness that is to be shared equally.
Coventry, replanning and rebuilding its shattered city, gave a great welcome to Her Royal Highness Princess Elizabeth when she arrived last Saturday to inaugurate the new civic scheme.
Today, we are looking forward to the future. And I do not intend to dwell on the horror of that night in November 1940, when the flames destroyed so much of your city. It is, I hope, receding into history. Here, in this central square of Coventry, we are burying the bitter and painful memories of the past.
But the city's saddest loss in its fiery ordeal of 1940 was undoubtedly that of the lovely old cathedral.
When Howard vows to rebuild the cathedral, he very quickly asks for help from Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, and he seemed a very good choice, a safe pair of hands. But the building which Scott designed was enormous, absolutely enormous. And it very soon annoyed the Bishop of Coventry, a new bishop who arrived in 1943, Neville Gorton, who was a great radical and was convinced that Gothic architecture, or the sort of streamlined neo-Gothic, which Scott specialised in, sent all the wrong messages for this new city. He wanted to attract young people, and he felt that really a new cathedral should be a new cathedral and not paying lip service to period styles. Scott, in the end, resigned, 1946. He just couldn't carry on.
Should the old cathedral be restored, or should it be new like the rest of the city? Should it be on the same site or elsewhere? Should it be traditional or contemporary in design?
One view favoured rebuilding the old cathedral, stone for stone. But the Royal Institute of British Architects and others argued that a younger generation of modern architects should be encouraged to look forward. A competition launched in the autumn of 1950 attracted more than 200 entries in a wide range of styles. These included a radical reimagining from Allison and Peter Smithson, which failed to impress the judges.
I declare the Festival of Britain open and wish it a universal success.
In the summer of 1951, Basil Spence was chosen to design the new Coventry Cathedral. Spence had trained and worked as an architect in Scotland before serving in an army camouflage unit during the war and taking part in the Normandy landings. Since then, he had mostly been designing for exhibitions, including pavilions for the Festival of Britain site.
He'd been doing lots and lots of exhibitions, which he was very good at, and they'd been very successful. But he knew that there was something important that he wanted to do, and he'd always said this. I mean, in his book, he said that when he was on the beaches in Normandy, that he was thinking, what would I like to do if I survive this? And it was to build a cathedral.
The winning place in the competition for the design of the new cathedral was awarded to Mr. Basil Spence. In their report, however, the assessors said that in selecting this design, they not only felt that it was the best design submitted, but that it was the one which showed that the author had qualities of spirit and imagination of the highest order.
Of course, you're bound to start an argument if you build a cathedral now, because people love the old buildings. So do I. I love the old cathedrals, but remember this. When these old cathedrals that everybody admires were first built, they were modern. They were new. This is the tradition, and this is exactly what I'm trying to do at Coventry.
So Basil, it seems to me that your first great idea was when you decided not to build the cathedral on the site of the old one, but to put it at right angles to the old one and at a lower level. Now, did this idea come to you in a flash, or did you work it out gradually?
No, actually, it came very quickly. It came the very first 5 minutes. I was so impressed by the old building. I thought it was so beautiful, torn open by war, that I felt I had to keep it. So in the competition conditions, it could have been wiped out. I felt it stood for the sacrifice, yeah. And I had to build a new one that stood for the triumph of the resurrection. I knew exactly that I had to do this. I didn't expect to win the competition, but I knew I had to do it.
What Spence does, of course, is to make a composition which includes both the ruins and his new building, but linked by a porch, which is a place to pause, if you like, before going into the new one, but also forms this kind of important axis between the cathedral close and the new city centre.
Before construction could begin, the cathedral authorities had to secure a licence from the Minister of Works in the Conservative government, David Eccles. Coventry's Labour councillors were concerned that the cathedral would divert craftsmen and building materials, both of which were in short supply from the construction of housing, schools and hospitals. They lobbied for postponing work on the cathedral by a decade, without success.
Sir David Eccles, the Minister of Works, had issued a standard form, licensed to build one cathedral. To the Lord Mayor of Coventry, he wrote, "We cannot tell how many people are waiting in this country and abroad for this church to rise and prove that English traditions live again after the Blitz. The threat of far worse destruction is with us today, demoralizing and corrupting our thought. We have never had as great a need for acts of faith."
Centuries-old Priory Row was closed and the blitzed buildings nearby demolished to clear the area for excavation. The old cathedral took 125 years to complete. Now, for the first time in 3 centuries, a new cathedral was to be built in one continuous operation lasting only 7 years, using materials and techniques unknown to the builders of medieval times.
In the architect's office, a team of draftsmen worked on the plans for 9 years, making thousands of detailed drawings. Every smallest detail of the building was worked out in plans, drawings, and scale models.
When I think back to those whole 10 years, it was this amazing sense of that we were all doing something important, that we were bound up in it. And there was an extraordinary spirit. And my dad was nothing if not energetic. And, you know, we all sort of drew off that, I think.
Spence, in his book, Phoenix at Coventry, says that there was quite a lot of pressure to employ a local building contractor in Coventry, of whom there were many, of course. But he was nervous about their ability to realise such a long project to the very high specification he needed. And he was delighted when Langs put in the lowest tender and so had to be accepted, and was confident that their experience would produce excellent results. And so it proved, I mean, the quality of the craftsmanship, everything from the stone masons and the laying of the stone to the extraordinary flooring and finishes of the cathedral are remarkable.
It was a strangely difficult period because there wasn't enough money to build one cathedral, as the building license signed by the minister said, you know, permission to build ... one cathedral. But Langs actually didn't win a whole contract. They won the first contract of the foundations and the basement, and the next stage had to be renegotiated. And in the process, Basil was evolving and changing the details one way and another. So it was actually very complex.
Two years later, in March 1956, the foundation stone was laid by Her Majesty the Queen and blessed by the Archbishop of Canterbury.
I declare this stone well and truly laid.
Already, in many parts of England, work was in hand, bringing to life the hope and inspiration which this new cathedral symbolized. The stone was quarried at Hollington in Staffordshire, where Englishmen have quarried stone for 1,000 years. Some of these blocks of pink Kuiper sandstone weighed as much as 5 or 6 tons. The blocks, when cut, were loaded on lorries and taken day by day to the mason's yard 3 miles away at Rosa. In this yard, each block was cut into smaller stones to form the outer wall. Very slowly, the stones were cut by saws, 10 inches an hour. Every block was planed and cut and then masoned by hand by craftsmen of long experience. They gave each stone a number, and no 2 stones were quite the same. Each day, 7 tons of numbered stones left the yard for Coventry, 50 miles away. Every day, the stones arrived on the site. The plan for the erection of the cathedral depended on this steady flow of materials.
Over 70 miles of scaffolding, yes, 70 miles of it, were used outside and inside to construct the walls and roof. The roof is supported on the perimeter walls by reinforced concrete beams. Spanning 90 feet, it's a vault in the form of a concrete shell 4 inches thick, with post-tension tie beams.
Spence, I think, would not himself ever have claimed to be that interested in structure. So he worked with people who were, and it was his good fortune to work with Ove Arup, who was then one of the outstanding engineers after the war, and who met with him and really worked out a completely different system for the vault, so that the vault, as realized, is a kind of almost freestanding thing. It sits within this very heavy stone, rather buttressed shell, and the slender columns which separate nave from side aisles hold up the vault.
Now, by 1958, the great design was taking shape. All the money for this building, apart from the war damage claim, came from voluntary contributions.
There were, in the end, a great number of gifts, some very substantial ones, but the basic funding from the official payment for the cathedral was based upon calculations for the building of 1 number plain cathedral. I think the word plain is actually in the Act. A plain replacement was funded. And in a way that brings into sharp focus the reason why the works of art are so important.
Well, it's a crazy idea, actually, in the first place, to get married in the cathedral, because there wasn't a cathedral. It was a building site. But we had both been working with Dad, because we were all young and we'd been partying together. And so it seemed to be the only place. We had to get a special license. We were married in the crypt. It was actually the chair store, but it had been turned into a chapel with a lovely cross done by Geoffrey Clark. It was February. I don't know why we chose February. I just can't think. Anyway, I had a very pale lilac wedding dress, full length. And so as I tripped through I didn't trip, but as I glided through the building site, it was rather lovely because the workmen were all there and they clapped us as we went in, which is fantastic. My dress was about the first sort of 6 inches was full of sort of rubble, really, building rubble.
As the walls rose, artists and craftsmen were preparing works of art to adorn the cathedral.
One of Basil's many assets in terms of his masterly control of the cathedral challenge, that as he was developing and as the cathedral design was evolving and being modified this way and that, at that early stage he was embracing artists to be involved.
He was an artist himself, and he always had a great interest in the arts and always felt that there should be no dividing line between art and architecture, that they would merge seamlessly.
Now, you made your cathedral a concentration of all, or almost all, that was most alive in English art in the 50s. Did you have any difficulty in getting these works past your committee?
On the whole, not. But they're a Midland committee, and it was difficult for them to accept controversial figures.
Amazing what you made them swallow.
But they were wonderful. I'd like to say that they backed me up most wonderfully, and in the end they trusted me a great deal. But everything didn't always go smoothly.
10 windows rising from floor to roof were to light the nave. At the Royal College of Art in London, 3 artists, Lawrence Lee, Keith New, and Geoffrey Clark, had started to design these windows in 1952. These designs alone took many months to complete in the studio prepared by Lawrence Lee.
We decided that we would adopt the usual Christian symbolism, but that it would be impossible to use Bible stories and lives of saints, but rather we should do the thing in a more abstract form.
In these Coventry windows, the English art of stained glass was born again. Medieval skills were revived and new techniques invented to make the hundreds of colors and textures. Cool green, gold ruby, plain blue, streaky amber.
Designed in pairs for either side of the nave, the windows offer a cycle from birth to death, from green shoots through passion and strength, with red as the dominant colour, and on to an age of experience in a multitude of hues. The windows evoking wisdom and old age are a deep, rich blue. And a final pair of golden glass evoke the Christian afterlife.
The only division between the old and the new cathedral will be the great glass screen designed by John Hutton. Traditionally, the English cathedral has a ceremonial entrance front, which is usually decorated with carvings of the saints and angels. Coventry Cathedral is no exception, so here it will be transparent, and the design reminds one that the price for the new altar was great. Many people killed, and many, many more maimed and injured for life. So the new altar will be seen through the bodies of the saints and the martyrs.
In a studio in St. John's Wood, London, John Hutton was designing figures of saints and martyrs and engraving them on 90 panels of glass. These were to form the entire west wall. John Hutton had worked on his sketches for more than 5 years. When each drawing was completed, it was enlarged to actual size and then engraved on the glass. He endured the labor of grinding these figures for more than 2 years.
This is not coloured glass, it's ordinary British plate glass on which I engrave these figures. Glass engraving has been done for upwards of 1,000 years, but in a rather different way. Normally the glass is laid on a revolving grindstone, but I use a small grindstone on a hand drill and draw on the glass as an artist would, really. I had to do a lot of experimenting to get the kind of effects that I'm going to need for this job, the degree of brilliance, and at the same time the boldness that will be needed for the figures at the top of the screen. Some of them will be about 70 feet up.
The screen which rises above me, an enormous glass screen, fills the whole end of the cathedral. When I say enormous, it's 70 feet by 40 feet. It's engraved by John Hutton with angels and saints and fathers of the church. Individually, some of them are designs a little bit voguish, modish, but taken as a whole, it makes a great effect. You have a feeling of the heavenly host rising above your head as you go in. Now I shall walk in through the glass doors. Glass doors, you know, one rather associates with banks or restaurants, whatever it may be. And for a moment I have profane associations, but the moment I get into the cathedral, those entirely slip from me, because the whole impression as one comes in is solemn and full of religious feeling.
My favourite of our artworks in some ways is just nestled at the bottom of the baptistry window, which is the font. This massive limestone boulder from a hillside just outside Bethlehem, which was the gift of Langs the Builders, the personal gift of Langs the Builders, shipped by road and sea and then road again. This incredibly tangible thing, when I'm taking people around the cathedral, I always get them to come and put their hands on it. So that you touch the historical, physical root of the faith that we proclaim in the cathedral. The shell-shaped scoop carved out by Ralph Bayer, of course, just kind of finishes it off. It is the most amazing thing.
It was a touching idea to bring a boulder from Bethlehem, and there was a great feat of international cooperation to get it here. But I can't feel quite happy about it. I think the idea of leaving this shapeless stone is foreign to the whole symbolism of baptism. The moment when you're being given a new form should be symbolized by something which is itself being given form, the best possible form. And I don't really very much like the way it stands on a sort of stalk. It's a detail, but the details here are so fine that one is entitled, I think, to criticize them.
Near Henley-on-Thames, John Piper was designing another great window, the baptistry window.
In his design, John Piper decided to let colour itself project the glory of baptism without using figurative shapes or symbolic forms. A simple pattern which would not conflict with the more elaborate designs of the nave windows.
When I was first asked to design this window, the shape and size of it, the actual form, had already been decided upon. Really, it's a pierced stone screen with a large number of rectangular holes, which demanded separate pieces of glass being designed for each one, of course. What it seemed to me to need most of all was simplifying, unifying in some way, and it's this that I've attempted to do. To me, the colour and form of the whole thing symbolizes the Spirit of God descending.
A complete model of the window was made in glass, painted and fired like the real thing. The huge window, 80 feet high, 51 feet wide, contains 6,000 square feet of coloured glass in 195 separate lights, spaced between deep carved mullions. A remarkable piece of stone construction.
I think the window is incredible, and the way that Patrick Renshins took the designs, including the spatters of paint, and turned them into glass is genius. And of course we now talk more about the Piper Renshins window rather than just the Piper window, partly for that reason. I love asking people what they see in the window, and the fact that it's sort of non-figurative I think is particularly helpful when we're trying to open up the building for a sort of spiritual response for people from perhaps different backgrounds.
Almost everything for the cathedral was made in Britain, but one of its chief embellishments was made in France. In the village of Felletin, near Aubusson, work had started making a great tapestry of Christ in glory, designed by Graham Sutherland. When finished, the tapestry would be the largest in the world.
The work in Felletin was fascinating because the whole village was weaving tapestries historically. So the scene there was incredible, with a great barn where the tapestry were being woven, but down close to the river was this shack in which one little Frenchman with a typical French beret was going around the bins of colour, and having looked at the artist's colour requirement for a particular colour, it was incredible talent. He would, with a serving spoon, virtually, pick out the pigments and put them together and mix them up, and the colour was perfect.
More than 100 different shades of colour were included in the artist's design. The skeins of wool were soaked in vats and hung on racks to dry. After the dyeing, the skeins of wool were wound onto bobbins. Sometimes threads of different colours were wound together to make particular textures and tones. This is Graham Sutherland's design for the tapestry. While work went on, it stood near the looms so that the weavers could match the colours.
And this leads to my final question, why you chose tapestry as the medium for your chief piece of figurative art.
Well, of course, I wanted a big picture behind the altar. And I know that the cathedral has to be considered orally as well as visually. And I had a restricted choice. I think mosaic would have had more brilliance, though I think the end would have to have been curved if it was mosaic.
Yes.
On the other hand, I know this is a plain cathedral, and I had to get acoustic absorbance somehow. So I felt tapestry was the best thing. And I was attracted by the idea of making the largest tapestry in the world and getting Graham Sutherland to do it.
Yes, well, it's a wonderful result.
To try to express in words the equivalent of the look one wants in paint almost invariably ends in failure, because words and painting are really separate means of expression. From time to time, I've tried to give clues as to the nature of what I'm trying to do. At the time, they seem true. Later, I really wish that I'd been silent.
Beyond the stalls and behind the altar, covering the east wall, Graham Sutherland's tapestry. Christ in glory. On either side of the figure of Christ, the four living creatures mentioned in Revelations. The first beast was like a lion, and the second beast like a calf, and the third beast had a face as a man, and the fourth beast was like a flying eagle.
What Geoffrey Clark gave to the cathedral was principally, I think, and very significantly, was the high altar cross. I think the high altar cross, again, it would be second perhaps to the font for me, for my favourite thing. It's got extraordinary movement in it. Some people see it as a bird. I don't really see it as a bird. I see one of the original crosses of nails at its heart, and then this movement out from that reconciling cross of nails in the arms and then up to heaven and rooted almost in the earth with this, quite strangely, the kind of sheath around the shaft of the cross, which looks almost like tree bark.
This Epstein that's behind us, for example, some mysterious reason, Epstein's work always led you got into trouble. Did you have trouble over that with your committee?
Well, apart from Graham Sutherland, he was the only one that the committee really questioned. I remember when I suggested his name in committee, and it was followed by a hushed silence, and then someone said, "But he's a Jew." But I knew they would ask this, so I said, "And so was Jesus Christ." And that stopped it, stopped that side of it.
And in the end, they were very proud of it.
Yes, but not without difficulty. We had to go and examine his work in the studio and all that sort of thing. And then, in the end, of course, they were delighted.
Yes.
The statue was unveiled by Lady Epstein at a service of dedication, another landmark in the rebuilding of the cathedral.
My Lord Bishop, my Lord Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I now unveil this statue by Jacob Epstein of St. Michael overcoming the devil.
Thank you, Sir Basil, for answering all my questions. And may I also thank you from all lovers of art for what you've done for British art during the last 15 years. the greatest and the most imaginative act of patronage for, well, at least a century.
High above the roofs of Coventry, beside the old cathedral tower, the builder's work is nearly done. The new building dominates the city.
As the main structure neared completion, attention turned to two small chapels, which had been elements of Basil Spence's design from the beginning. The Chapel of Unity was intended as a place of worship for all Christian denominations. Stained glass by Margaret Traherne was financed by a gift from the German evangelical churches, presented during a state visit by President Heuss of the Federal Republic of Germany. For the Guild Chapel, Anthony Blee designed a simple altar, above which hangs a crown of thorns by Geoffrey Clark.
And you see that as you move round it, it contrasts with these strongly marked vertical transoms that form the whole wall of the chapel. Between the transoms is plain glass, because it is the intention of the architect that anyone in this chapel should be conscious of the city of Coventry outside, the industrial city with its technical college and its factories and chimneys and so forth. This is the point at which consciousness of the city and feeling of the interior life of the cathedral can be at one.
By the end of the 1950s, Coventry was a city transformed, with extensive new housing, modern schools and hospitals, with a thriving commercial centre and a municipal commitment to culture.
Donald Gibson commissioned a good deal of public art for the city centre. He made sure that a new theatre was built. First municipal theatre to be built after the war, the Belgrade. He supported the long-running project for a new gallery of art, the Herbert, which was opened only in 1960. So within a few years, you've got 1958, the Belgrade, 1960, the Herbert opens, 1962, the cathedral opens, and all the sort of infrastructure which goes with them. So it was very much a kind of showplace.
But as elsewhere across England, the makeup of Coventry was changing rapidly. Local industry attracted an increasingly multicultural workforce, and there were many more young people with new expectations for their city.
The money which is now being spent on nuclear bombs could be spent upon old age pensions.
After nightfall, there is very little life about the streets of Coventry. For the majority of youngsters, there is almost nowhere to go except this one huge dance hall.
Well, someday I guess I'll find myself another little girl to take the place of my true.
This, by the way, was just an ordinary weeknight with hundreds of couples dancing to the strains of pop records.
Way above me.
I want to leave. I want to get to London. There's nothing to keep me here. All this, all these new buildings going, they're so boring. Can't stand them, There's no life at all, really. There's only the theatre.
Well, I like it, but I think that the new Coventry is not inhabited by Coventrians by birth. It's full of immigrants like me and other people of different colours and sizes.
And all they say was nay, nay, nay. Oh, throw the whiskey in the well. Take it, boy.
Many working families had never had it so good. But there were already the first signs of troubles ahead for the region's manufacturing industries.
You see, we're also not only worried about that side of it, about work going out of the city, we're also worried about the common market.
Now, I've said before, and I've always said it, we've fought for the conditions we've got here, and we've got good conditions, and I don't want to see them lost. And I feel that if we enter the common market, these people will come into this country and work, and we may lose what we've already got.
While Coventry was rebuilding itself physically, it was also trying to lay the foundations for something of even greater significance.
After the war, quite a few of us realized that sooner or later we must get back into international friendships, more particularly with those for whom we were estranged during the war.
Official exchange visits were organised with Stalingrad, Dresden and other cities in Eastern Europe. And the mayor invited his counterparts from around the world to an international conference. In 1961, a group of young Germans volunteered to help reconstruct the vestries of the old cathedral's ruins.
It's a work of peace, which the Germans call Operation Reconciliation. It's indeed a fine gesture by these young German craftsmen, especially as they are not responsible for what happened over 20 years ago.
Here I am in the doorway of the old cathedral. And on my right is the spire, which was so miraculously preserved from destruction and still retains over its ascendancy over the whole city. Well, of course, the Gothic style is marvelous. The expression of a civilization unified in its belief in God, which we are not. And when that tower was built, every single man and woman in Coventry was a believing Christian. What would be the percentage now, I wonder?
2 years before the cathedral was consecrated, one of Britain's first mosques was opened on Eagle Street in Coventry. But with the ancient tower of the city's Christian community still standing, the new cathedral was designed to be topped with only a slender 25-metre spire or flesh of openwork bronze.
We, with Arabs, had designed the flesh as a piece of metalwork construction with Geoffrey Clark's weather vane almost cross on the top. We went to the steeplejack and got a quotation for putting all this up into position. And it was a hefty quotation. So we were scratching our heads, and I suggested that we try and get a helicopter involved.
A Belvedere helicopter from number 72 Squadron based at Odium in Hampshire has taken off with the nylon ropes hanging from beneath the aircraft, ready to pick up this 78 feet bronze spire to put it on the roof of the cathedral. It's quite a hazardous operation indeed. Gently raising the spire now. Raising it very gently.
The bottom of this 78 feet spire is just about at roof level now. Now he's beginning to move along the cathedral roof. Coming down, in fact, I think that the RAF crew on the roof are holding the spire now. They're now holding the base of the spire. And the helicopter is now, it's slipped the tail, the spire is in position. After just over 10 minutes work, the spire is in position. Coventry, for centuries a city of 3 spires, is now a city of 4 spires. A moment in history indeed.
Coventry, a name that rang through the world 22 years ago, rings out anew, for its cathedral is reborn. Epstein's inspired St. Michael conquering the devil seems to link the dawn of faith with this new church, expressive of Christianity in 1962. Now, long after the Blitz that destroyed the old cathedral, comes the consecration of the new.
Mr. Barrett, as Town Clerk of Coventry, what particular problems have you had to deal with preparing for the royal visit?
The main problem was to estimate, or rather guess, how many visitors we might have in the city on the 25th of May. And we've assumed that one ought to prepare for 250,000, and that of those, possibly 30,000 might come by private car. Therefore, initially it threw up 2 problems. One, car parks, and secondly, the very human but very important question of what additional conveniences one ought to provide. We've solved, I think, the car park problem. There had to be places where people could expect to get public transport into the city and back out again afterwards. As far as the public convenience problem was concerned, the City Council bought, for example, 2 first-class mobile conveniences, which will help. And in addition, we're going to provide a number of temporary conveniences, in particular at these temporary car parks that we've provided for.
Well, it's obvious that you and your department have had a lot on your plate. Is everything under control?
We dare to think so. It won't be for lack of preparation if things don't go all right on the 25th.
And right outside we see that Her Majesty is arriving at the old west door of the cathedral, past the territorial men of the territorial regiment, the Royal Warwickshires, greeted by the bishop and the provost, wearing a coat and a dress of mimosa yellow silk, the perfect colour, silk in yellow and grey, that matches the predominant colours of the cathedral. Sir Basil Spence, the architect whose work this is and whose great day this is, greets Her Majesty just inside the old west door.
I think it was just sort of golden. I think it was a good day. It was a lovely day. The Queen was wearing gold and the cathedral was glittering. The music was wonderful. And it was just, I don't know what word you'd use, but it was just a joyous celebration, and I just remember being amazingly happy.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Ramsay, comes forward. The sun, which is now streaming at a most propitious moment through the multicoloured windows of the cathedral, strikes the magnificent cope and mitre that he wears and makes it gleam as he bends down to add his name to that of Her Majesty the Queen. This in silence. And how dramatic is the silence after all the singing and the pealing of trumpets. In these few moments, the cathedral is coming to life. The last signature is added, that of the provost. And the deed now becomes, in law, reality. The Queen takes her place at the rear of her own procession. The Provost comes with her, Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon walk behind. Private secretaries, equerries and ladies-in-waiting follow, and the ever-noble gentlemen-at-arms bring up the rear, making this wonderful heraldic background to these ceremonial scenes. The anthem ends. Her Majesty, with the verger preceding her, passes the ranks of diplomats, the representatives of 40 or 50 different countries of the world who've come on this day to the industrial diocese of Coventry. And there have been none in this cathedral more moved today than the representatives of Germany, who've come to cement the friendship and to accept the good faith and the love now offered to them by Coventry, which long ago forgave. This is Her Majesty's first real opportunity to look at the cathedral about her. And you can see she looks up and left and right at the colours of the windows, at the great baptistry window, and now at the big screen that she approaches as she finally leaves the cathedral.
The building of this cathedral is a story of inspiration. In the center of Coventry, a city famed for its industries, serving the material needs and comforts of men, it stands as an act of faith. It combines the traditions of architecture and the church with modern thought and constructional techniques. It shows that the arts and skills of our age can match the achievements of the past in the service of the spirit of man.
The building leads people on an emotional and a theological and a personal journey. I'm always anxious that people start their visit to the cathedral in the ruins, because that place of destruction is the place where we touch the honest experience of so many people in the world, and of course the experience of Coventry as a city. So it is a place of brokenness, and then we move through the porch into the new cathedral, where in the light and the colour and the space and hopefully some sense of safety, we move into a place of healing and hope. So it's that journey which is an emotional journey, which meets people in the reality of where they are, but it leads them into a new place. And it's a theological journey which says we meet Christ crucified, but we also journey to the place of resurrection and new life.
I think that the main idea of Basil Spence's cathedral, the idea which he said came to him in a flash, is indeed an inspiration. The relationship of the new cathedral to the old is a great architectural idea. And this vast empty space dedicated to the altar with the tapestry hanging behind it is really moving. But one can't get away from the fact that this is a difficult time in which to build a cathedral. I'm sure it was a wise decision to build in the style of the 50s, but because vital architecture must be built in the style of its time, and to say that this doesn't apply to a cathedral is almost to admit that a cathedral isn't a necessity at the time.
Well, it has taken a slice of my life, and it's been a great experience. And that will never, never be taken away from me. And I just did it. I tried to be a servant, you see. And it gave one fantastic strength just to be a servant and forget about yourself. Just be a servant. Because in the imagination, you know, there's always perfection. In the imagination, there's perfection. In reality, there isn't. Can't be. Can't be. Because in the imagination, if you see a fault, it changes. It changes just like a cloud. See? And you can always have perfection in your own mind. It's always beautiful. But when you put it down, and when you build it, all the faults are there.
I think he was very, very pleased with the reception. I mean, he had terrible letters, you know, saying how terrible it was and it looked like a bomb shelter and all of that, which hurt, because he wasn't very good at, you know, things like that really hurt. But I think on the whole, definitely, he felt it was something that he had always wanted to do, and that pretty well, he'd done all right, I think.
I think it has stood the test of time, and I think people have come to appreciate it more and more as post-war art, post-war architecture comes back into fashion. It's become better and better loved. I think that there's a rather sort of delightful comment about it, a characterization of it, written by John Hewitt, who was the Irish poet, who wrote an essay about the city in 1965, and he says it's the premier place of pilgrimage for an anxious, hoping, searching generation. So I think that conveys the sort of anxieties, the doubts and the optimism of the generation for whom it was really built. Now we're different, we're older, or it's a new generation who have different kinds of responses to it, I think, and for whom the Blitz and all it signified are a very, very long way away.
If you look into Spence's and I think Dick Howard's description of the Chapel of Unity, it is described as a place for worship of different faiths coming together, which of course at that time meant the Catholics, or possibly not even the Catholics, but the Baptists and the Methodists. Now, of course, we read that phrase in a different way. It's very obvious, you know, who we worship and what we stand for, but that doesn't mean that we can't offer really deep-seated and genuine hospitality to people of all faiths. So I think what we do today is we say hospitality is our number one value. It's ridiculous to try and say that you're open to God but not open to all of God's children. We work very, very hard to say to people, both locally and from further afield, please come in, you're welcome, we're pleased to have you here.